Good evening and welcome to a very special book talk. I want to extend Book Talk's gratitude to Professor Jenny Kitzinger for being our point of contact to this sort of series of events, and to Cathy Rentzenbrink, the author of the incredibly moving memoir that we'll be discussing this evening.
So, without further ado, this is very special for me. I met Cathy some years back now when she was in the process of writing the book, and it's been fantastic to see it come to fruition and to see what a difference it's making in the world and what praise it has attracted. And there are two reviews I just want to quote from. So one is from the Sunday Times. The book's real power lies in Rentzenbrink's skill as a writer, her ability to unearth precise and agonizing details quietly, with no self-pity or drama. It falls into a tradition of beautifully written accounts of grief, such as Joan Didion's The Year of Magical Thinking. Rentzenbrink unearths the profound truths of human experience. In terms of making a difference in the world, it is in a way a profoundly political book. And Henry Marsh, who's the author of Do No Harm, a book reflecting on the power of medicine now to extend the life of the body long after the life of the soul, the spirit, the person has left, wrote, "Profoundly moving, this book should be read by anyone concerned by the way our society has such difficulty in accepting that meaningful life is about more than just a beating heart." What order did you write it? Did you begin at the beginning? What was the first section you wrote, even in draft form?
So I had written about the night of the accident before. When I was on maternity leave, I did an Open University creative writing module, and module 4 was called life writing. And even so, I absolutely wasn't going to write about this. And then at some point, I just realised that it was kind of profoundly emotionally dishonest to really write about anything but this. So I wrote about the night of the accident for that assignment and got sort of, 94% or something. Well done. And then didn't write anything else for years. And then when I wrote, after talking to Tom in Korea, I wrote about the funeral. He gave me a notebook. And he said, right, start at the funeral. He said, write about trying not to laugh at the funeral. And I wrote about that on the plane and the way home. And that bit is quite, it's a bit edited, but the funeral bit is, I intentionally kind of slightly left it as I'd written it into this blue notebook. And then again, it was several months before I picked it up again. And the funeral now is sort of in the middle of the book. I wrote it all out of the chronology of it. So I didn't write it in the order it now is, because I just couldn't. There were so many barriers to me writing the book, like millions, but one of them was I just didn't see how I ever could. And the most difficult bits, the night of the accident I thought was actually quite easy to write about, because although at the time I thought that was a big deal, looking back on it, it was just nothing, comparatively. But the bit I couldn't face was I think it was the hope. It was hope into despair. That was the bit I couldn't face. So I wrote that right at the end, but then in the book I do chart chronologically how it happened. But my editor made me do that, and she was completely right.
And I find it fascinating that you've written the accident and you've written the funeral, and it's that yawning gap in the middle.
Yeah.
But actually, for me, is the heart of the book. And I think when we talked early on, I remember you crying, describing the accident, and saying, "I don't know why I'm crying, this isn't even the heart of it."
Yeah.
And it fits with the writing that actually, for most people, the night your brother is hit by a car or the night you bury him is the worst possible. And actually, what this book captures for me is the agony of the journey in between.
Yeah, the 8 years in between those things.
I'd love to ask some more questions, but I wonder if it's a good time to just ask you to choose a bit to read.
Okay, I'll read from the beginning.
I love being read to by authors, and you do read very beautifully, thank you. I sort of want to kind of close my eyes and fall to sleep. It's like a bedtime story, except it's not in this case.
If you do, I'll kick you when
Please
you tell me. So, and Henry Marsh, who you mentioned, reviewed my book in the New Statesman. And so for the paperback edition, I'll also read, I quoted a bit from him, a bit from his review of my book. So I quoted that at the beginning. So I'll read that and then I'll just read you the first few pages. So this is Henry Marsh. Emergency brain surgery is very simple. It involves drilling holes in the skull and draining out blood. and is well within the competence of most junior doctors. The question of whether to operate to try to save the patient's life, however, is much more difficult. The prayer tree. The chapel is not how I remember it. All these years I've imagined a simple wooden room buried deep in the hospital. Instead, light shines through a splendid stained glass window onto an altar with an embroidered cloth and large brass candlesticks. It feels like a church. I asked the chaplain if everything looks the same as it would have done when I was here over 20 years ago. We've had a new carpet, she tells me, and pink covers for the seats, though soot blows down from the roof, so I'm always out here with a little hoover. There's a smallish tree to one side of the room with a blue and white cuddly elephant propped against the base and bits of coloured paper clipped among its leaves. That's newer, the chaplain says. A prayer tree. That won't have been here when you were. I walk over to it and take one of the leaves between my thumb and forefinger. Plastic, but convincing from a distance. I read the messages written on the bits of paper. This must make it easier for atheists, I think. Far easier as an atheist in extremis to write something down and attach it to a tree than to kneel in front of an altar and try to work out how to make a deity you don't believe in listen to what you have to say. Some of the messages are addressed to God, some to the living, some to the dead. There's a range of handwriting styles, differing levels of ease with grammar and spelling. It's the badly punctuated ones that I find most poignant. I imagine they demanded the most effort. Some are in a spindly, elderly hand, others in childish, rounded letters. I hope the baby is all right when you have it. 15 years and I miss you like yesterday. Dear God, thank you for listening. Please pray for my little brother. Love you loads, little buddy. For my dearest, greatly missed daughter. She died 25th of the 10th, 83. I've never got over it. Pray for us all. I pause, lost in these hints and echoes of other people's stories, other people's love, and then wonder what I would have written if this tree had been in place when I stumbled in here on my way from intensive care to the relative's overnight room. I know what I wanted then, but how would I have found the words? To whom would I have addressed my plea? Please don't let my brother die. Dear God, please don't let my brother die. Please pray for my brother, I don't want him to die. Don't die, Matty, please don't die. And the years collapse, and I see myself kneeling and crying and begging, with my hands clasped together in prayer, talking to some unknown force. Please don't let him die. Please don't let him die. Please, I'll do anything, only please don't let him die. And what strikes me now, as it never has before, is that I can't say my prayers went unanswered. I was given what I asked for. My brother did not die. But I did not know then that I was praying for the wrong thing. I did not know then that there is a world between the certainties of life and death, that it is not simply a case of one or the other, and that there are many and various fates worse than death. And that's what separates the me standing here now by the prayer tree from the girl kneeling in front of the altar all those years ago. She thought she was living the worst night of her life, but I know now that far worse was to come. The thing she feared was that her brother would die. But I know now that it would have been better for everyone if he had. It would have been better for everyone if, as she knelt here, begging for his life, his heart had ceased to beat. If the LED spikes on the monitors had turned into a flat line, if death had been pronounced, accepted, dealt with, it would have been so much better if Matty had died then. She was praying for the wrong thing. I was praying for the wrong thing.
It fascinates me how about the person then looking back at the person, she, I. And I guess I wanted to ask you, how did the book change as you wrote it? And how did you change as you wrote it?
So, when I first wrote the book, and actually even in the version that my editor acquired, quite a lot of the earlier bits were written in the third person. So the whole bit about the night of the accident. So when I wrote about the night of the accident, got the 94%, that was all written in the third person. So it starts off with something like, I can't imagine her, let me try and see her. So it starts off with the me and the now, and then the whole bit of the night of the accident is she does this, she does that. And I definitely think with writing the book, there was something very important that I had to do, which is that I had to reclaim my selves, all those splintered selves. I had to go back and accept myself and own that experience. But I've found myself again and bundles us up a bit more. And I now very much look back with compassion rather than with judgment. And I look back with pity rather than with judgment.
Why were you judging yourself then? What's that about?
Well, we just do, don't we? I mean, I know it's a very funny thing. I do remember, I mean, it was a massive moment for me when I was talking to you in your house in Cardiff, eating your homemade biscuits. And
They weren't homemade. I didn't know how to make a biscuit, but they're homemade in the book.
Yeah, I've immortalised Jenny's homemade biscuits.
Fiction.
I remember when I was talking to you, and I've written about it in the book, it was such a shift, because you said to me, do you think your parents should feel guilty? And I said, no, of course not. And then you said to me, so why should you feel guilty? And I thought, that's a very good question. Why do I feel guilty? And it was the first time when I'd been able to flip it like that. And I wasn't entirely fixed then, but that was the first thing.
And I think it's one of the power of your book, and I interview many families who are going through this still now. They have a relative in a long-term coma, vegetative state, and they're struggling with caring for them, or the decisions, or what would this person want. And in each case, reading your book and being able to look from the outside at your story, and also see someone who's kind of normal and nice and funny and not a monster, because there's always a feeling, particularly around the difficulty of if you're going to let someone die who's in a long-term vegetative state, the only way you can really do that is withdrawing a feeding tube. And that's hugely emotive, hugely problematic. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, but I do know that you've really helped families face that and think about it and talk with doctors about it.
I think that makes me feel so sort of happy and grateful. I know I'm crying, but I'm a crier. I often cry when I'm happy. I feel so moved by that. There was a point when a friend of mine read it quite early on. Because of course I didn't expect this. I really did think of this as my millstone, my sad story. I never really expected anyone else would read it. And it took me ages to realise there was a wider significance for it. And, so I was at this event and somebody said to me, when did you realise you'd written a very socially significant book? And I said, have I? I didn't expect this. But there was a point when a friend said to me, she said, imagine what it would have been like for you if you'd had someone like you. And I think that's very powerful, isn't it? So I just do feel very moved by the notion that, I think to be of service is important in a wider sense. And I think one of the things that was so difficult for us was that we had to invent this process. Well, I mean, we didn't, because we watched Tony Bland on the news, and that sort of slightly sowed the seed. So probably without that, would we ever have, so it's not like we invented it, but I had to invent the only way I could think about it and live, which took me an awfully long time to do. It took me such a long time to think through the moral, ethical, psychological, philosophical issues. And then, of course, I met you and found out other people have felt like this. I remember feeling as well, because I was quite, I found Jenny because I was writing the book and I was facing my fears, and I'd been brave enough to Google, because for years I'd stayed off anything like that because I was just too terrified of the whole thing. But I remember thinking, and this might be true, if I'd found you earlier, I might not have written the book. I honestly think I processed the world through reading. There was nothing to read. There was nothing for me to read. If it had existed, I might not have had to write it myself, I think. And I really do think that's true. And I remember when you showed me some transcripts, and just the joy of finding out that other people were saying things like, you wouldn't do this to a dog. Other people were saying things like, they don't do this on death row. I thought, other people have have thought, I'm no longer so alone. You know, other people have thought this, and it was very powerful and wonderful. So to pull it together a bit for people does make me feel really, proud. And I hear from loads of medics and lawyers saying that they're putting me on the syllabus, and that will be I'm going to be on the syllabus. That kind of nice.
It's very funny because I met Tony Bland's parents recently, and I was saying, do you know what a difference you've made? And I interview people who say, well, we saw Tony Bland on the news and it opened up the possibility.
Yeah.
And they went, oh, that's lovely. It makes meaning of our son's death.
Yeah.
And they actually were very like what you just said. They were sort of saying about their part of that journey. And I love this sort of network and connection. And it's partly a social movement. And it's a very complex social movement because on the one hand, if you're fighting to have a feeding tube withdrawn from someone you love, you think it's the best of all possible alternatives. On the other hand, it's not the alternative you choose. And
no. I was really scared at one point, I realised. I was so frightened I would encounter someone like me, like a year in. I'm still a bit scared of that as well, so if any of you are here, just go easy on me. I was so terrified, and when I came to that thing at Putney, and my agent came with me, I was all of a quiver. I was so frightened that somebody, you know, I don't know, maybe 8 months, 9 months in, I feel nothing but sympathy for anybody who is still in the other place. Because of course we, as I say in the book, there was a very long time when I would have reacted very angrily, I think. Well, again, would I? Because actually the knowledge that that other people had travelled this thing, I think, would have made it so much easier because we wouldn't have had to do the thinking or invent the thinking ourselves. Henry Marsh, again, is very interesting on this. He says it's what question do you ask? If you ask if you say to the relative, do you love this person enough to look after them no matter what happens? Most of us, if we do, of course, we will do everything. Ours will be the one that survives. And if you ask the question, like, so this is right after, if you say to them the question, would this person like to be alive in this outcome? Then it's a very different answer. And that's what I feel. We did not ask ourselves that question for about 4 years. That we didn't do that. We just threw love and conviction and dedication and this kind of insane, single-minded devotion at the situation. And that's what we did. And I've always been very frightened that I will encounter somebody in that stage who will be very angry with me and I really won't know what to do. Because, well, I just guess I'll stand there and soak it up, probably. Because it's not for me to try to bring them to any other sort of understanding. But that's what I was but I was frightened, again, back to the barriers to writing the book, I was frightened about so many things, most of which have never happened. Because what I get much more is you've changed my mind about how I think about things. That happens to me a lot. And even somebody wrote to me and said, I read your book, expecting that I'd be sending you an angry letter. And instead I just think you're brilliant and so are your parents. So that's nice. And I don't think anyone who, I think if anyone's read the book, they see I think I take people through the journey, don't I?
I think you do with families, and it doesn't surprise me you're on the syllabus for medics, because I think you also highlight things about how medics can communicate, because no family's going to ask themselves the questions that doctors maybe should be asking about best interest.
Shall I read another bit? So this is called In Trouble. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning when I got home from the Rainbow. The pub was dark and my parents were in bed. I climbed the back stairs, walked past Matty's room and on to my own. I undressed, pulling the ribbons from my hair, looking around at the sage and lilac walls. I got into bed. What did I do? What did I think about before the events of that night shunted everything else out of the way? Maybe I listened to a mixtape or played a record on my record player, which was black with green and purple buttons. Matty had the same one, presents from our parents the previous Christmas. Did I read? It seems likely. I read everything from Jane Austen to Jilly Cooper. I'd recently discovered Julian Barnes at college and wanted to study French so that I could live in an attic in Paris and read Flaubert in his own language. I loved the thought of myself as someone who read novels in French. Of course, back then, reading was still a pleasure and not a defence. This was the last time I wouldn't fear closing my eyes for what I might see, the last night I wasn't in terror of what might happen by the time I woke up. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard someone shouting outside in the car park. Nothing unusual about that. Customers often pitched up in the middle of the night looking for their wallets or keys or wives. I opened my window to see what was going on. The man below didn't look mad or drunk. He was standing next to his car. The headlights were on, and I could see a woman in the passenger seat. "Is this where Matthew Minturn lives?" "Yes, I'm his sister." "You better come then, he's in trouble." Trouble. It was a worrying word, but a small one. I pulled on all the clothes I'd just taken off and felt a rush of adrenaline that was not unpleasant. No need to wake my parents. I could sort out whatever it was. Some prank, some schoolboy silliness. Nothing that couldn't be smoothed over by a sympathetic older sister. Matty would be grateful. I'd be a little bit cross with him, but then we'd have a laugh about it. Maybe tell the parents, maybe not. I picked up my keys, grabbed my handbag and flew down the back stairs and out into the car park. The man started driving as soon as I climbed into the back seat. He told me that Matty had been knocked over by a driver who did not stop. The man and his girlfriend had been in the car behind. They'd stopped, found out Matty's name from the girls he was walking with, called the ambulance from the phone box at the edge of the village, and then headed on to the pub. I knew immediately that this was bigger than anything I could have imagined. I wished I'd woken my parents, but it was too late to change that now. When we pulled up in the road, I saw crowds of people in the headlights, all the same people who'd been at the Rainbow and were walking home along the same road. They parted and I floated through them. I heard people say, "That's his sister." Matty was lying in the road. He looked so long. His body was covered in coats. A girl we knew called Vicky told me he was unconscious, that she'd put him in the recovery position. I knelt next to him, touched his forehead, stroked his cheek with the back of my fingers. His eyes were closed. There was no damage to his face. I couldn't see any blood. I felt for a pulse, found it, kept my fingers wrapped around his wrist so I could feel the evidence of his life. One of the girls he'd been with told me that a car had come out of nowhere. They'd been walking along, the three of them, Matty on the outside, and suddenly he wasn't there anymore. Then his body had crashed back onto the road in front of them and the car had sped off into the distance. "He gave me his jacket to wear," she said through tears. "He gave it to me because I was cold." Lots of girls were crying. There was a whiff of drunken hysteria in the air, and I knew I must stay calm and not submit to it. Vicky and I made people stand back so they were not crowding in on Matty. Some of the men had formed a circle facing the other way, ready to warn oncoming traffic. Sirens, flashing lights. When the ambulance arrived, I could tell from the demeanour of the men how serious it was. They scooped Matty onto a stretcher and in through the back doors. "You're his sister. Hop in, lass." They were so quick, so deft. One of them sliced through Matty's t-shirt with what looked like a set of shears. The red letters of the could no longer be made out as the whole t-shirt was soaked with blood. "But I can't see any cuts," I said. "Why is there so much blood?" "It's coming from the back of his head, lass," said the ambulance man. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. The man gave me little jobs to do, showed me how to stick the pads onto Matty's chest, how to clip on the wires. The driver was on the radio. "We've got a bad one here," he said. "I think we're talking Pinderfields." I knew Pinderfields was a big hospital near Wakefield. The other man explained we'd go straight to Pontefract Hospital so Matty could be stabilised and assessed before being transferred somewhere bigger. "Keep talking to him, love," he said. "Keep him with us." I talked and talked and talked. I told Matty everything would be okay. I told him about the man coming round to the car park at the back of the pub. If he'd gone to the front door, he'd have got Mum and Dad. I should have woken them up or phoned them from the hospital. I had a feeling that Matty had a bit of a shine for Vicky, and I babbled at him about this being an extreme way to get her attention. I was still talking when we arrived at Pontefract and he was wheeled away from me. I wanted to go with him, but they wouldn't let me. "I need you to help me fill in some forms, love," said a nurse, putting an arm around me. "Good luck, lass," said the ambulance man. The nurse let me use their office phone. I picked up the chunky receiver and dialed the number, stopping when there was still one digit to go. I thought how my parents would be surprised to hear me on the phone when they assumed I was in my bedroom across the corridor, that they only had a few seconds left of sleeping in happy ignorance of what had happened. I couldn't leave it any longer. We both needed them. I dialed the last number in 9 and imagined the shattering of the silence in the bedroom. I'm at Pontefract Hospital with Matty. He was knocked over. They say it's very serious. I went to the entrance of A&E to wait for them to arrive. A group of men who'd been in a fight were kicking off because they'd been hanging around for a long time, and a nurse told them off. "This young lass's brother has been knocked down, and that's why we don't have any time for you," she said. They were instantly well behaved. One of them bought me a cup of tea from the machine, and they gathered round me, their big bloody faces full of kindness and concern. My composure vanished the moment my parents appeared. We sat on the bolted down plastic seats, and I sobbed into my mother's shoulder while my father wrapped his arms round her. After a few minutes we were taken to see Matty. He was lying on a bed, with his eyes closed, a collar around his neck and an oxygen mask over his face. There were smears of dried blood on his upper chest and face, but he looked reassuringly normal. "He's a big lad," said Dad. "He'll get over a knock like this." The doctor told us Matty had a serious head injury and was being transferred to Leeds General Infirmary, that a surgeon was waiting for him there. We followed the ambulance in the car, and I lay down on the back seat, stared at the motorway lights through my tears, and thought of all the times we'd driven from Yorkshire to Cornwall at night to see my grandparents. Matty was whisked away as soon as we got to Leeds, so we didn't see him. I was distraught, but Mum told me we didn't want to be getting in the way, and that any time we spent with him would delay surgery, would delay fixing him. We were shown to a little room with table and chairs, a kettle and an ashtray, and we drank tea for what felt like hours and hours. I noticed a Guinness stain on the bottom edge of my cream shirt, knew that it would have happened as I leant over the pump at work earlier, and I thought how much the world had changed in the lifetime of that little stain. There.